Hey guys, tonight we begin in one of the driest places on Earth. A place so dry that some objects left there have survived for centuries simply because the atmosphere apparently forgot how weather works. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket, and let your brain slowly drift toward the enormous deserts of southern Peru. Tonight we're talking about the Nazca Lines. Those gigantic drawings scratched into the earth by people who, for reasons historians are still debating, decided the best way to spend their time was making enormous monkeys visible mainly from the sky. Which is ambitious, slightly confusing, but also deeply human. And the question floating gently over tonight's story is this: were the Nazca Lines an astronomical code? Were they giant calendars, star maps, cosmic diagrams? Or were generations of researchers simply staring at deserts too long and beginning to hallucinate geometry? As always with ancient mysteries, the answer is complicated, and also involves several academics becoming emotionally attached to straight lines. So settle in, relax your shoulders, and let us slowly wander into the desert. The Nazca Desert stretches across the southern coast of Peru. It is dry, wide, quiet, and oddly beautiful in the way all giant empty places eventually become. During the day, it can feel endless. At night, the sky opens completely, crowded with stars so sharp and bright that ancient people probably spent a great deal of time staring upward and reconsidering their place in the universe. Which, honestly, same. Long before modern tourists started flying overhead in tiny planes while gripping the armrests in terror, the Nazca people lived here between roughly 100 BCE and 800 CE. They inherited traditions from earlier cultures and developed a society adapted to an environment that was not exactly welcoming. Water was precious. Farming required careful planning. Survival depended on understanding the land intimately. And yet, despite all the practical challenges of desert life, these people also spent enormous amounts of energy creating gigantic geoglyphs across the landscape. Not small symbols. Not modest little artworks tucked politely beside villages. No. They made drawings hundreds of feet long. Massive birds. Spiders. Monkeys. Whales. Geometric lines stretching for miles. Giant trapezoids, spirals, strange humanoid figures with expressions suggesting they had just realized someone left the ceremonial potatoes in the sun too long. The obvious problem with all this is that the designs are best viewed from above, which immediately caused modern people to lose their minds. Because humans love nothing more than encountering ancient objects and immediately assuming aliens were involved. It is one of our favorite hobbies, right behind inventing complicated coffee orders and arguing online about bread. But before the alien enthusiasts arrived wearing sunglasses indoors, archaeologists tried to understand the Nazca Lines through more grounded explanations. And one of the most influential theories came from astronomy. Specifically, the idea that the lines formed a giant astronomical calendar or celestial map. Now, at first glance, this theory sounds fairly reasonable. Ancient civilizations often paid close attention to the skies. Agriculture depended on seasonal cycles. The sun, moon, and stars guided planting, rituals, navigation, and religion. The Egyptians aligned monuments astronomically. The Maya tracked Venus obsessively. Ancient Mesopotamians studied planetary movements with incredible dedication despite lacking modern telescopes and, more importantly, comfortable office chairs. So perhaps the Nazca people were doing something similar. Enter a German mathematician and archaeologist named Maria Reich. And honestly, if anyone deserves recognition for sheer commitment to a historical mystery, it is her. Maria Reich arrived in Peru in the 1930s and became utterly consumed by the Nazca Lines. Completely. Entirely. Her whole life turned into desert geometry. She measured lines by hand, swept sand away with brooms, studied alignments, protected the site from damage, lived with remarkable simplicity, spent decades under the desert sun trying to understand what these enormous markings meant. Imagine dedicating your entire existence to giant dirt drawings in a scorching desert. Academic obsession truly operates on another level. Reich believed many lines aligned with astronomical events, solstices, star risings, solar positions, seasonal markers. One line, for example, appeared to point toward the setting sun during the winter solstice. Others seemed connected to constellations. And gradually a theory emerged that the Nazca Lines functioned as a massive astronomical observatory, which sounds extremely dramatic. And historians do enjoy a little drama now and then, quietly, in tweed jackets. According to this idea, the Nazca people created giant diagrams to track celestial movements across the year. The desert itself became a calendar, a sacred landscape tied to cosmic rhythms. And to be fair, when you stand in a desert under a clear sky with no modern light pollution, astronomy becomes very hard to ignore. The stars dominate everything. They feel close enough to touch. Ancient people noticed patterns. They remembered them. They built stories around them. Entire religions formed around celestial cycles because the sky was the largest visible thing available, and humans naturally enjoy assigning meaning to enormous, mysterious objects, preferably while wearing ceremonial hats. But over time, problems emerged with the astronomical theory, mainly because researchers started checking the alignments more carefully. And unfortunately for romantic theories everywhere, statistics can be deeply annoying. Some lines did align with astronomical events. But when thousands of lines exist pointing in countless directions, some alignments happen naturally by coincidence. If you draw enough lines across a desert, eventually one points at something interesting in the sky. Mathematics becomes unavoidable that way. It is similar to staring at clouds until one resembles a duck wearing trousers. Eventually, researchers began arguing that many supposed astronomical alignments were selective interpretation. People noticed meaningful examples while ignoring all the lines pointing nowhere particularly special, which is a deeply human habit. Still, the astronomical idea never fully disappeared, because there really does seem to be some relationship between the Nazca culture and celestial observation. The challenge is determining how much. And this is where the story becomes wonderfully complicated, because the Nazca Lines are not one single thing. They were created over centuries by generations of people. Different purposes may have existed simultaneously. Some lines may indeed connect to astronomy, while others relate to water rituals, religious processions, sacred pathways, or social gatherings. Ancient societies, inconveniently, were composed of actual humans with layered motivations rather than single-purpose puzzle designers. Modern audiences often want one clean answer, but history rarely cooperates. Instead, it wanders around half asleep, carrying, symbolic pottery. The Nazca people themselves left no written explanation. No convenient stone tablets saying, "Greetings, future archaeologists. Here is a helpful diagram explaining our giant hummingbird," which was honestly inconsiderate of them. So researchers pieced together clues from archaeology, anthropology, environmental evidence, and comparative religion. And one increasingly important clue involves water. Because if you live in a desert, water becomes almost spiritual. The Nazca civilization depended heavily on underground aquifers and irrigation systems. Survival required careful coordination with natural cycles. Rainfall patterns mattered enormously. Fertility rituals mattered enormously. Ceremonies connected to agriculture mattered enormously. Several archaeologists now believe many lines functioned as ceremonial pathways related to water rituals. People walked along them during religious processions, which changes the whole atmosphere of the site. Instead of giant messages meant to be viewed from the air, the lines become lived spaces, sacred routes woven into the desert itself. And honestly, this interpretation feels deeply human. Imagine groups of people moving slowly across the landscape in ritual processions beneath enormous skies. Priests carrying offerings. Communities gathering seasonally. Songs echoing softly across the open plains while everyone collectively hopes the crops survive another year. Far less alien conspiracy. Far more exhausted agricultural spirituality. Of course, not everyone accepted the ceremonial explanation either. Because the Nazca Lines attract theories the way old castles attract ghost stories. Some researchers propose they marked underground water sources. Others argued they represented clan symbols. Some thought they were pilgrimage routes. A few wandered directly into cosmic energy territory and never emotionally returned. And then, naturally, came the extraterrestrial theories. Because ancient mysteries on television apparently require at least one person dramatically whispering the word visitors. The basic alien argument went something like this. The lines are best seen from above, therefore ancient humans could not have made them for human purposes. Which ignores the important fact that humans are perfectly capable of creating gigantic things without airplanes. The Nazca people made the lines by removing dark surface stones to reveal lighter soil underneath. The process itself was surprisingly simple. Stakes and ropes allowed straight lines. Basic planning allowed larger figures. Hills nearby provided partial viewpoints. No spaceships required. Just patience. An extraordinary amount of patience. And probably several people saying things like, "Wait, does this monkey look strange to you?" Still, the alien theories persisted because humans enjoy mystery. We especially enjoy mystery involving deserts, ancient civilizations, and shapes visible from the sky. It activates something deep inside the imagination. But in reality, the true story is arguably more interesting. Because the Nazca Lines reveal something profound about human beings. Across history, humans repeatedly reshape landscapes to express beliefs larger than themselves. We build pyramids, cathedrals, stone circles, burial mounds, sacred roads. We carve meaning into the earth, even when survival is difficult, even when resources are limited, Even when the neighbors are probably wondering why you are spending 3 weeks constructing an enormous spider nobody can properly see from ground level. And the Nazca people did all this in one of the harshest environments imaginable, which makes their achievement strangely moving. The desert preserved their work for centuries because rainfall remained minimal and winds stayed relatively calm. Had the climate been slightly different, the lines might have vanished completely. History survives through astonishing accidents sometimes. Entire civilizations disappear, while one giant bird drawing quietly remains. Let's float gently over now to another strange piece of the Nazca puzzle. Because eventually researchers realized the lines were not isolated creations at all. They belonged to a much larger ritual landscape filled with ceremonial centers, burial sites, textiles, pottery, and evidence of complex social organization. And like many ancient societies, the Nazca culture combined beauty with instability. Because beneath the elegant art and cosmic speculation was a civilization constantly negotiating environmental stress. Droughts threatened survival. Resources fluctuated. Political systems shifted. Religious authority mattered deeply because uncertainty surrounded everyday life, which may explain why ceremonial activity became so important. When humans face unpredictable environments, rituals often intensify. People seek order, meaning, cosmic reassurance, sometimes through prayer, sometimes through giant geometric artwork visible from nearby hills. Human creativity truly adapts in fascinating ways. And slowly, over generations, the desert filled with symbols, not rushed, not chaotic, but deliberate, measured, patient, a civilization speaking softly across centuries through lines in the earth. And somewhere under those same stars, ancient people likely looked upward wondering about their place in the universe, just as we still do now. Only with fewer phone notifications. And significantly more llamas. End of part 1. By the middle of the 20th century, the Nazca Desert had become one of those places that quietly pulls certain people completely out of ordinary life.
Not tourists, exactly.
Though tourists would eventually arrive in large floppy hats carrying cameras and severe dehydration. No, the desert attracted obsessives. The kind of people who look at a giant, unexplained line stretching across empty land and think, excellent. I will now dedicate 40 years to this. And perhaps no one embodied that energy more completely than Maria Reich. So tonight, let's slowly wander into the life of a woman who essentially married herself to a desert full of geometric confusion. Maria Reich was born in Germany in 1903. She studied mathematics, astronomy, geography, and languages, which already sounds like someone preparing for a very specific side quest. In the 1930s, she traveled to Peru, initially working as a tutor and translator. A perfectly normal beginning. Respectable.
Calm.
Then she encountered the Nazca Lines. And that was basically the end of conventional life. Because some people casually visit historical sites and think, interesting. Others spend the next several decades crawling around deserts with measuring tape while sunburned beyond recognition. Maria belonged firmly to the second category. At the time, the Nazca Lines were not globally famous. Pilots had begun noticing strange markings from the air during the 1920s and 30s, but systematic study remained limited, which meant there was still room for one intensely determined mathematician to arrive and say, "I shall now become guardian of the giant hummingbird." And honestly, she did. Reich devoted herself almost entirely to documenting and preserving the lines. She mapped figures, measured angles, recorded dimensions, protected sites from erosion and development. She lived simply, worked endlessly, endured harsh desert conditions, all for lines. Very large lines, yes. But still, there is something wonderfully eccentric about the entire situation. Imagine explaining your career at social gatherings. "So, what do you do?" "Oh, I spend my days studying massive geometric scratches in one of Earth's driest deserts." And then someone quietly backing away toward the refreshments table. But Reich was not eccentric in a careless way. She was disciplined, methodical, deeply serious about her work. And she became convinced that the Nazca Lines contained astronomical significance. Not random doodles, not decorative art, but an enormous celestial system tied to the movements of heavenly bodies. According to her interpretations, certain lines aligned with solstices and star positions. Some animal figures may have represented constellations. The entire desert, she believed, functioned almost like a giant observatory. Now, to modern listeners, this sounds dramatic, but we should remember the historical context. 20th century archaeology was deeply fascinated by astronomy in ancient cultures. Researchers increasingly recognized how carefully many civilizations tracked celestial events. Temples aligned with sunrise positions. Monuments reflected seasonal cycles. And because astronomy played such an important role elsewhere, the Nazca theory felt plausible, especially when standing under those skies. The desert nights around Nazca are extraordinary.
Clear. Vast.
Quiet enough to hear your own thoughts becoming philosophical. The Milky Way stretches overhead with shocking clarity. Constellations blaze across the darkness. The moon casts sharp shadows over the plains. It does not require much imagination to picture ancient priests staring upward while contemplating cosmic order. Or at least wondering why Orion keeps showing up every winter like an overly reliable neighbor. Reich spent years analyzing line orientations. She argued that specific alignments connected to solar and stellar events. One famous example involved a line that seemed to indicate the winter solstice sunset. And, importantly, she was not some fringe conspiracy theorist waving crystals around near a cactus. She approached the work scientifically,
Carefully.
earnestly. The problem was that later researchers began applying broader statistical analysis. And statistics, sadly, can flatten even the most romantic theories like a bureaucrat stepping on a flower. Because once scholars mapped thousands of lines, they discovered many pointed in many directions. Some astronomical alignments appeared meaningful. Others seemed random. Critics argued that with enough lines available, selective interpretation becomes almost inevitable. You notice the alignments that fit your theory and quietly ignore the ones pointing toward absolutely nothing except maybe a hill and someone's exhausted alpaca. This does not mean Reich was entirely wrong. Far from it. Many modern researchers still believe astronomy played at least some role in Nazca culture. The issue is scale. Were the lines primarily astronomical? Or was astronomy merely one layer inside a larger ceremonial system? That distinction matters, because humans rarely build sacred landscapes for only one reason. Religious life blends together. Agriculture, ritual, astronomy, politics, water management, ancestor worship. All of it overlaps like an ancient administrative nightmare. And the Nazca world appears to have been richly interconnected in exactly that way. But while academic debates continued, Maria Reich kept working, year after year, under brutal sun, sometimes alone, which gradually transformed her into something almost legendary herself. Local people began calling her the Lady of the Lines, a title that sounds both respectful and faintly supernatural. You can almost picture villagers whispering about a mysterious foreign woman wandering deserts, measuring monkeys. And over time, Reich became internationally associated with Nazca preservation, which turned out to be critically important. Because modern infrastructure has an unfortunate habit of bulldozing ancient history whenever someone proposes a new highway. At various points, roads, vehicles, and human expansion threaten the lines. Some damage occurred accidentally, some through carelessness. One truck driver famously drove directly across part of the site, which must rank among history's most unfortunate navigation decisions. Where exactly are we? Well, apparently on a 2,000-year-old hummingbird. Reich fought tirelessly for protection measures. She advocated for recognition, conservation, and international awareness. And eventually, global attention grew. The Nazca Lines became one of the world's most famous archaeological mysteries, which brought both admiration and chaos. Because fame is complicated, tourism increased, air tours multiplied, speculation exploded, documentaries appeared featuring dramatic music, and people sang phrases like "ancient secret." The lines became trapped inside modern myth-making. And honestly, the 20th century was especially vulnerable to this sort of thing. People increasingly felt disconnected from modern industrial life. Ancient mysteries offered enchantment, wonder, alternative histories suggesting forgotten wisdom and cosmic knowledge. The Nazca Lines fit perfectly into that emotional landscape, especially because they are genuinely strange. That part cannot be overstated. Even when explained rationally, the lines remain surreal. Straight corridors slicing across barren plains for miles. Gigantic birds with elegant curved wings. Spiders longer than buses. Abstract geometric shapes stretching toward distant horizons. And all of it created without modern surveying equipment. Just careful planning, labor, community effort. Human beings are remarkably capable when sufficiently motivated by religion, symbolism, or collective enthusiasm. Also stubbornness. Ancient civilizations possessed astonishing amounts of stubbornness. Now, one interesting detail often overlooked involves visibility. People sometimes assume the Nazca figures are impossible to comprehend from the ground. But that is not entirely true. Nearby hills provide elevated perspectives. Certain figures can be partially recognized from surrounding slopes. The creators likely understood the designs conceptually even without full aerial views. Think of medieval cathedral builders. Many decorative elements sat far above normal visibility. Gargoyles perched on rooftops. Tiny carvings hid in shadows. Builders created them anyway. Not necessarily because humans would admire every detail closely, but because the act itself carried meaning. Sacred creation mattered. The Nazca Lines may function similarly. The process of making them may have been just as important as seeing them. And that changes the emotional texture completely. Instead of asking, why would they make images only visible from the sky? We begin asking, what rituals accompany their construction? Imagine workers slowly clearing stones beneath relentless sun. Ceremonial leaders overseeing geometric layouts. Communities gathering seasonally to renew sacred pathways. The lines become active spaces. Not puzzles, not codes, but lived religion, which, admittedly, sounds less exciting than alien landing strips, but is probably closer to reality. And reality, in this case, remains deeply fascinating anyway, because Nazca society itself was complex and artistically rich. Their pottery featured vivid colors and intricate imagery. Their textiles displayed extraordinary craftsmanship. Religious iconography appeared everywhere. Some figures depicted mythical beings carrying severed heads, because ancient religions occasionally drifted into unsettling territory despite all the lovely weaving. Human sacrifice likely existed in some form within Nazca ritual life, though even here historians debate details carefully. What seems clear is that religion structured much of society. Ceremonies linked communities together. Sacred practices reinforced social order. Environmental uncertainty heightened the importance of ritual specialists. And this is where astronomy may still fit naturally. Ancient people often interpreted celestial cycles spiritually. The movement of stars and planets reflected divine order. Solstices marked sacred transitions. So even if the Nazca Lines were not giant star charts in the simplistic sense, astronomical symbolism may still have infused their meaning. Modern discussions sometimes create false choices. Either the lines were astronomical or ceremonial. But ancient societies did not separate those categories neatly. The heavens, seasons, water, fertility, and ritual all blended together into one worldview. A worldview where walking a sacred line across the desert during a solstice ceremony while praying for rainfall would make complete sense. And honestly sounds rather peaceful. Except for the heat. The heat sounded terrible. Now, eventually, newer technologies entered the story. Aerial photography improved mapping dramatically. Satellite imagery revealed additional geoglyphs. Drones uncovered previously unnoticed figures, which means even today, the desert continues revealing secrets. Researchers recently identified more geoglyphs hidden across surrounding regions, including figures from earlier cultures predating the Nazca themselves. Apparently, once humans in the area started drawing giant things on the ground, everyone became oddly committed to the tradition. Cultural hobbies can escalate like that. And as discoveries accumulate, interpretations continue evolving. Some geoglyphs appear connected to pathways leading towards ceremonial centers. Others cluster near water sources. Some may indicate territorial markers. There may never be one single explanation, which frustrates certain people enormously. Modern audiences crave definitive answers. We want the final reveal, the tidy documentary conclusion. But archaeology often operates through uncertainty. Evidence remains incomplete. Meanings shift gradually through interpretation. And ancient humans were every bit as psychologically layered as modern ones. Probably more layered, honestly. They had fewer distractions. So tonight, as we drift slowly across the Nazca Plains beneath impossible stars, perhaps the most comforting realization is this. The lines do not need to be supernatural to inspire wonder. They already reveal something extraordinary. A civilization facing harsh environmental conditions still chose to create beauty on a monumental scale. They organized labor, shared symbolic systems, passed traditions across generations. And somewhere in that endless desert, people looked upward at the same constellations we still recognize now, only without satellite interference. And without internet debates insisting the spider was clearly built by time travelers, which must have been restful. End of part 2. If you spend enough time studying ancient civilizations, eventually you notice a repeating pattern. Humans become extremely spiritual whenever their survival depends on unpredictable weather. And honestly, fair enough. Modern people panic when the Wi-Fi flickers for 6 seconds. Ancient agricultural societies were dealing with drought, crop failure, and the possibility of everyone collectively starving because the clouds simply decided not to cooperate that year. So, tonight, let us drift deeper into the world of the Nazca people themselves. Away from modern theories for a little while. Away from documentaries with ominous music and suspiciously dramatic drone footage. Let's instead imagine actual daily life in the desert. Because the Nazca civilization was not built around mystery. It was built around survival. Southern Peru is beautiful in a severe sort of way. Dry river valleys cut through immense stretches of barren land. Rainfall is scarce. Water exists unevenly beneath the surface, hidden underground like the world's least convenient treasure hunt. And yet somehow, communities flourished there for centuries. The Nazca people developed irrigation systems and underground aqueducts called puquios. Some still function today, which is honestly embarrassing for modern infrastructure. These systems allowed water to circulate through desert regions that otherwise would have struggled to support agriculture. Crops like maize, beans, squash, and cotton became possible through careful management and communal labor, which means water was not merely practical. It was sacred, and this matters enormously when discussing the Nazca Lines. Because increasingly, archaeologists suspect many geoglyphs and ceremonial pathways related directly to rituals surrounding fertility, rain, and life itself, which sounds less flashy than ancient cosmic airport, but far more human. Imagine living in a place where every successful harvest depended on forces beyond your control. You would watch the skies carefully. You would track seasons obsessively. You would pray. And you might also create massive ceremonial landscapes designed to connect your community with divine powers governing water and fertility. that begins to feel much closer to the emotional heart of Nazca society. One reason scholars moved toward this interpretation involves the placement of many lines. Some connect directly to ceremonial centers. Others appear designed for walking rather than viewing. Wide trapezoids and long corridors seem almost like ritual avenues stretching across the desert floor. Not art for spectators, but spaces for participation. And once you picture people physically moving through the lines, everything changes. The desert stops feeling empty. Suddenly, it becomes active, ceremonial, alive with footsteps, songs, offerings, and processions. At certain times of year, communities may have gathered to perform rituals connected to seasonal cycles. Priests carrying sacred objects, participants wearing elaborate textiles, music echoing softly over the plains. Not rushed, not theatrical, slow and deliberate, which is fitting, honestly, because almost everything about the Nazca Lines feels patient. The figures were not carved in a single afternoon by one enthusiastic man with a stick and too much free time. They accumulated gradually across generations. A civilization quietly inscribing meaning into the earth. And in many ancient societies, sacred movement mattered deeply. Pilgrimage routes existed across the world. Ritual walking symbolized spiritual journeys. Ceremonial pathways connected temples, shrines, and sacred landscapes. The Nazca Lines may belong within this broader human tradition, which also explains something important. Many lines overlap. If the entire system were intended as one perfect astronomical code, overlapping pathways would create complications. But if different groups use the landscape over centuries for evolving rituals, overlap becomes natural. Ancient humans were not preserving a museum exhibit for future archaeologists. They were living there, adding layers, reworking traditions, probably arguing occasionally about whose ceremonial route was interfering with whose sacred trapezoid. Human communities remain wonderfully consistent that way. Now, another fascinating clue comes from the imagery itself. The animal figures are not random. Birds appear frequently. So do monkeys, spiders, whales, dogs, and hummingbirds. Many creatures held symbolic importance within Andean belief systems. Birds especially connected heaven and earth. Some represented fertility or seasonal change. Water creatures symbolized life-giving forces. Spiders may have been associated with rain, which immediately makes the desert full of giant animal figures feel less like abstract puzzle-making and more like religious symbolism woven directly into the environment. The famous hummingbird, for instance, may have carried associations with renewal and vitality. Though admittedly hummingbirds also look permanently caffeinated. Even sacred symbolism cannot fully disguise that energy. And then there is the spider, long legs stretching elegantly across the desert. One researcher connected it to a species associated with rainfall cycles, which means the enormous spider geoglyph may have functioned partly as a symbolic appeal for water. Imagine future civilizations discovering giant logos painted on modern buildings and trying to determine whether they represented sacred rituals. To be fair, some modern corporations already operate with deeply religious energy. Now, while all this ritual interpretation sounds convincing, the astronomical question never entirely disappears. Because the Nazca people almost certainly observe the skies closely. Agricultural societies need calendars. Seasonal awareness matters. Solstices and celestial cycles often shape ceremonial timing. So modern scholarship tends to adopt more nuanced positions. Rather than claiming the Nazca Lines formed one giant astronomical map, researchers increasingly suggest astronomy existed as one element inside a broader ceremonial worldview. Which makes sense. Ancient religion rarely divided reality neatly into categories. The sky affected seasons. Seasons affected crops. Crops affected survival. Survival affected ritual. Everything connected. Modern life encourages compartmentalization. Science here. Religion there. Agriculture somewhere else. Taxes lurking ominously in the background. But ancient societies experienced the world more holistically. The heavens were not separate from daily existence. They were woven into it. And in deserts especially, the night sky becomes emotionally overwhelming. Without urban light pollution, stars dominate the landscape completely. Constellations rise with startling clarity. Planetary movements become obvious over time. You begin noticing patterns naturally. Even modern people camping beneath dark skies often experience a strange mental shift. The universe suddenly feels larger, older, more personal somehow. Now imagine experiencing that without smartphones, electric lighting, or endless digital distraction. The stars would become companions,
Guides.
characters and stories passed across generations. And perhaps somewhere along those ceremonial pathways, Nazca priests tracked celestial events while leading rituals connected to fertility and renewal. Not because they possessed supernatural knowledge, but because they were human. Humans always search the skies for meaning. Now, unfortunately, not all interpretations remained grounded. Because once the Nazca Lines entered popular culture, increasingly strange theories arrived. Especially during the mid to late 20th century, when ancient mysteries became deeply entangled with pseudo-archaeology. And here we encounter one of history's most persistent modern habits. Looking at ancient achievements and deciding humans could not possibly have accomplished them normally. Aliens become involved surprisingly fast. Sometimes after only one oddly shaped rock. The Nazca Lines proved irresistible to these theories because aerial visibility seemed mysterious. Writers claimed the figures could only make sense from the sky, therefore advanced beings must have guided their construction. Which sounds dramatic right up until you remember hills exist. Also planning. Also geometry. Also human intelligence. The Nazca people did not need aircraft to create large-scale designs. Experiments have repeatedly shown how simple tools allow accurate geoglyph construction. Stakes, ropes, measurement, coordination. That is enough. No extraterrestrial project managers required. And honestly, ancient humans deserve more credit. People built pyramids, aqueducts, road systems, observatories, and massive temples through organization and accumulated knowledge. Human societies are extraordinarily capable without outside cosmic assistance, though admittedly less capable when assembling modern furniture instructions. Now, despite weak evidence, alien theories became wildly popular through television specials and sensational books, partly because mystery sells, but also because modern society often feels spiritually disconnected. Ancient enigmas offer enchantment. They suggest hidden wisdom and forgotten truths waiting just beyond ordinary explanation. The Nazca Lines became a canvas for modern imagination. And perhaps that says as much about us as it does about the Nazca themselves. We project our anxieties and hopes onto the past constantly. Some people see evidence of advanced lost civilizations. Others see spiritual symbolism. Others see astronomical systems. Others just see very large birds. And maybe all interpretation begins there. Humans searching for meaning in patterns, which is exactly what ancient people were probably doing too. Now, let us gently wander toward another layer of Nazca life. Because while modern discussions focus heavily on giant lines, the Nazca culture also produced astonishing art. Their pottery was colorful and highly sophisticated. Ceramics depicted animals, mythological beings, plants, and ceremonial scenes in vivid detail. Textile work displayed incredible craftsmanship. Ritual objects reflected a rich, symbolic universe. This was not some primitive, isolated society stumbling accidentally into giant artwork. The Nazca were skilled artists and engineers operating within a complex cultural tradition, and their religious world appears deeply tied to transformation. Many depictions show hybrid beings, part human, part animal. Mythical creatures carrying symbolic objects. Figures associated with fertility and sacrifice. Ancient religion often embraced fluid boundaries between natural and supernatural worlds, which sounds mystical today, but probably felt perfectly normal then. People interpreted dreams seriously. Ritual altered consciousness. Ancestors remained spiritually present. Mountains possessed sacred power. The world felt alive. Modern life often strips environments of meaning. Ancient societies tended to saturate landscapes with symbolism. A river was never just a river. A mountain was never just a mountain. And a giant hummingbird carved into the desert was definitely not just decorative landscaping. Everything connected to cosmic order somehow. Even if that cosmic order occasionally appeared extremely confusing. Now eventually, environmental pressures intensified. Evidence suggests prolonged droughts affected Nazca societies significantly. Water systems became strained. Agricultural stability weakened. And like many civilizations facing ecological stress, social structures likely became more fragile over time. Religious ceremonies may have intensified during these periods. Because when conditions worsen, humans rarely become less spiritual. Usually the opposite. Communities seek reassurance. Ritual authority grows. Sacred traditions become emotionally essential. Imagine priests leading ceremonies across the desert while crops fail gradually year after year. People watching the skies desperately,
hoping,
searching for signs. And suddenly those giant lines begin feeling less mysterious in a modern puzzle box sense and more emotionally understandable. They reflect anxiety,
Faith.
collective endurance, a civilization negotiating survival beneath enormous skies, which, honestly, is a far more powerful story than alien tourists stopping briefly in Peru for geometric art projects. And somewhere across those silent plains tonight, the lines still remain.
Birds.
Spirals. Endless corridors stretching toward distant hills. Patient marks left by people who lived, worried, celebrated, prayed, and disappeared centuries ago, leaving only symbols in the earth, and a surprisingly large number of academic arguments. End of part 3. One of the funniest things about the Nazca Lines is that for centuries they simply existed quietly in the desert while the rest of the world went about its business. Empires rose and collapsed. Kings married cousins because apparently Europe had only 6 available royal people at any given time. Entire continents transformed politically. And meanwhile, out in southern Peru, a gigantic hummingbird sat patiently in the dirt waiting for humans to notice it properly, which eventually they did, though not immediately. Because from the ground, many Nazca figures are difficult to recognize fully. You can walk beside the lines and see trenches in the earth, but the larger shapes reveal themselves best from elevated perspectives. Nearby hills help somewhat, but airplanes changed everything. And this is where the story takes on a wonderfully 20th century atmosphere. Imagine early pilots flying across southern Peru in the 1920s and suddenly noticing giant geometric designs stretching beneath them. That must have been deeply unsettling. One moment you are navigating over barren desert, probably already stressed because early aviation involved enormous courage and very questionable safety standards. Then suddenly you glance downward and discover a monkey the size of a football field staring back at you from the earth itself. A difficult experience to process calmly. As aviation expanded, reports spread. Archaeologists became increasingly interested. Photographs circulated internationally. And the Nazca Lines slowly entered global imagination. Now, unfortunately, the 20th century possessed a remarkable talent for turning ancient mysteries into extremely dramatic entertainment, particularly after World War II, because modernity changed humanity's relationship with the past. Technology advanced rapidly. Nuclear weapons appeared. Space exploration began. Airplanes crossed oceans. Television entered homes. Suddenly, ancient civilizations seemed simultaneously distant and newly mysterious. People started wondering whether forgotten knowledge existed, whether modern civilization had overlooked hidden wisdom, whether the ancients somehow understood things we did not, which sounds philosophical, but also led directly to bookstores filling with paperbacks featuring pyramids glowing mysteriously under lightning storms. And few sites attracted this energy more powerfully than Nazca. The lines seemed perfect for speculation. Massive designs. Visible from above. Unknown purpose. Ancient creators. Minimal written records. Honestly, it was almost unfair how ideal the setting was for conspiracy theories. Then came Erich von Däniken, and with him, things became very strange very quickly. Von Daniken was a Swiss author who rose to fame during the late 1960s with theories claiming extraterrestrials influenced ancient civilizations. His book, Chariots of the Gods, became enormously popular, and one of his major examples was the Nazca Lines. According to von Daniken, the lines resembled landing strips for alien spacecraft, which is one of those theories that sounds dramatic until you think about it for more than 8 seconds. Because actual runways generally require smooth surfaces. The Nazca Lines are not smooth surfaces. Many are narrow trenches or delicate markings unsuitable for landing anything larger than perhaps an extremely cautious pigeon. But details rarely stop exciting theories. Von Daniken's ideas spread widely through television documentaries, magazines, and popular culture. Ancient aliens became an entire genre. And to be fair, humans absolutely adore this genre. It combines archaeology, science fiction, mystery, deserts, and dramatic narration spoken by men who sound permanently concerned. What more could television ask for? The problem, of course, is that these theories often underestimate ancient people themselves. The implication becomes, these ancient humans could not possibly have achieved this, which says more about modern assumptions than ancient capabilities. Because the Nazca Lines are difficult, yes, but not impossible. Archaeologists have demonstrated repeatedly how geoglyphs can be constructed using basic surveying techniques. Wooden stakes found at the site support this understanding. Experimental recreation succeeded without advanced technology. The Nazca people possessed intelligence, organization, artistic skill, and time. That combination accomplishes quite a lot historically. Sometimes entire empires. Sometimes giant desert monkeys. And honestly, the real achievement is more impressive precisely because humans accomplished it themselves. No cosmic engineers descending from space. Just communities cooperating across generations. Now, despite academic criticism, ancient alien theories persisted because they satisfy certain emotional needs. Modern life often feels disenchanted, bureaucratic, overly explained. Mysteries restore wonder. People want hidden meanings, secret histories. The possibility that reality contains deeper layers waiting to be discovered beneath ordinary existence. And deserts amplify these feelings naturally. There is something psychologically powerful about wide, empty landscapes. They encourage imagination. Silence expands thoughts. Distances feel timeless. The Nazca Desert especially carries an eerie stillness. Stand there long enough and modern life begins feeling strangely temporary. No traffic, no notifications, no fluorescent lighting humming above office ceilings. Just wind, stone, sky, and lines stretching toward the horizon. You begin understanding why people project enormous symbolic meaning onto the place. Now, meanwhile, actual archaeologists continued doing slower, less glamorous work, which mostly involved measurement, excavation, mapping, analysis, and trying very hard not to roll their eyes during alien interviews. Researchers studied settlement patterns around Nazca. They excavated ceremonial centers like Kawachi, an important religious site connected to Nazca culture. And Kawachi changed interpretations significantly because it revealed how ritualized Nazca society really was. The site contained plazas, mounds, ceremonial architecture, and evidence of large gatherings. Pilgrims likely traveled there for religious festivals and communal ceremonies, which fits beautifully with the theory that many lines functioned as ritual pathways. Imagine groups walking across the desert towards sacred centers during seasonal ceremonies. The lines guiding movement physically and spiritually. Suddenly, the entire landscape transforms into a ceremonial network. Not random drawings, not secret codes, but sacred geography. And ancient sacred geography often appears enormous because religion organizes space symbolically. Medieval cathedrals dominated European towns. Egyptian pyramids reshaped horizons. Nazca communities inscribed beliefs directly into the desert floor. Different cultures, same human instinct, make meaning visible. Now another important discovery involved the timing of line construction. The geoglyphs were not created all at once. Different styles emerged across centuries. Earlier Paracas cultures made geoglyphs on hillsides before the Nazca expanded traditions onto flat desert plains. This gradual evolution matters because it undermines simplistic single-purpose explanations. The lines were not one giant coordinated project suddenly appearing overnight. They accumulated historically. Traditions shifted. Communities adapted practices over time. And honestly, this layered development feels much more believable than one unified master plan designed by extraterrestrials with a passion for geometry. Ancient societies evolved continuously, just like modern ones, though with fewer podcasts. Now, one especially charming detail about Nazca archaeology is how much walking it involves. Researchers spend enormous amounts of time traversing deserts under relentless sun, mapping lines, measuring pathways, documenting erosion, quietly reconsidering all career decisions around noon. Field archaeology sounds romantic until you remember it frequently involves heat exhaustion and sand inside absolutely everything. Maria Reich herself became almost mythic partly because of this endurance. She reportedly swept lines clean with a broom personally. Imagine that level of commitment. Most people struggle to maintain houseplants. Meanwhile, Maria spent decades preserving gigantic geometric figures one broom stroke at a time. There is something oddly moving about such devotion. And over time, Peru officially recognized the lines as national cultural treasures. UNESCO eventually designated the Nazca Lines a World Heritage Site. Protection increased, though challenges remained. Tourism brought economic benefits, but also environmental pressure. Vehicles damaged certain areas. Foot traffic created risks. At one point, activists from Greenpeace accidentally caused controversy by entering restricted zones near the hummingbird geoglyph during a publicity event, which historians probably watched unfold while gently massaging their temples in despair. Ancient sites are fragile, especially in deserts where preservation depends partly on delicate surface conditions remaining undisturbed. One careless footprint can last astonishingly long, which feels metaphorically appropriate somehow. Human actions linger. Now, while preservation efforts improved, scholarly debates continued evolving. Some researchers emphasized water symbolism increasingly strongly. Others focused on social cohesion. Ritual labor projects may have strengthened communal identity. Building and maintaining lines could unite dispersed populations through shared ceremonial activity. And this idea fascinates me personally because humans constantly create giant cooperative projects partly to reinforce belonging. Cathedrals, festivals, monuments,
Parades.
even modern sports stadiums operate with faintly ritualistic energy if you observe carefully enough. People gather collectively around symbols larger than themselves. The Nazca Lines may have served similar social functions. Communities coming together repeatedly across generations to renew sacred landscapes and shared identities. And perhaps astronomy existed naturally within this framework, not as secret scientific code, but as part of ritual timing and symbolic cosmology, because ancient people absolutely cared about the heavens. The moon affected tides and calendars. The sun governed seasons. Constellations marked agricultural cycles. Sky observation mattered practically and spiritually. Modern scholars generally reject simplistic, astronomical observatory models now, but many still acknowledge celestial alignments within specific contexts. Some lines likely did correspond intentionally with solar events. Others probably did not. Reality becomes messy again, which historians secretly prefer because it keeps conferences employed indefinitely. Now, let us float gently toward one of the most fascinating emotional aspects of the Nazca mystery. The simple fact that humans today still feel compelled to search for hidden meaning there.
Why?
Why do the lines captivate modern imagination so intensely? Partly scale, certainly. Humans respond emotionally to enormous things, but also ambiguity. The Nazca Lines resist complete explanation, and uncertainty creates imaginative space. Every generation projects new ideas onto them. Astronomical calendars, alien runways, sacred pathways, water rituals, cosmic symbols. The lines become mirrors reflecting contemporary hopes and anxieties. And perhaps that endless reinterpretation is fitting, because ancient sacred landscapes were never static anyway. Meanings shifted over time, even for the people who created them. Religion evolves. Symbols accumulate layers. Stories change. Maybe the Nazca Lines were always meant to provoke contemplation rather than provide neat answers. Or maybe ancient priests would find modern debates absolutely hilarious. Imagine explaining internet conspiracy forums to a Nazca ceremonial leader. Yes, thousands of years from now people will assume you built this spider for extraterrestrials. And somewhere in the afterlife, an exhausted priest quietly responding, "No, we just needed rain." End of part 4. One careless footprint can last astonishingly long, which feels metaphorically appropriate somehow. Human actions linger. Now, while preservation efforts improved, scholarly debates continued evolving. Some researchers emphasized water symbolism increasingly strongly. Others focused on social cohesion. Ritual labor projects may have strengthened communal identity. Building and maintaining lines could unite dispersed populations through shared ceremonial activity. And this idea fascinates me personally because humans constantly create giant cooperative projects partly to reinforce belonging. Cathedrals, festivals, monuments,
Parades.
even modern sports stadiums operate with faintly ritualistic energy if you observe carefully enough. People gather collectively around symbols larger than themselves. The Nazca Lines may have served similar social functions. Communities coming together repeatedly across generations to renew sacred landscapes and shared identities. And perhaps astronomy existed naturally within this framework, not as secret scientific code, but as part of ritual timing and symbolic cosmology. Because ancient people absolutely cared about the heavens. The moon affected tides and calendars. The sun governed seasons. Constellations marked agricultural cycles. Sky observation mattered practically and spiritually. Modern scholars generally reject simplistic, astronomical observatory models now, but many still acknowledge celestial alignments within specific contexts. Some lines likely did correspond intentionally with solar events. Others probably did not. Reality becomes messy again, which historians secretly prefer because it keeps conferences employed indefinitely. Now, let us float gently toward one of the most fascinating emotional aspects of the Nazca mystery. The simple fact that humans today still feel compelled to search for hidden meaning there.
Why?
Why do the lines captivate modern imagination so intensely? Partly scale, certainly. Humans respond emotionally to enormous things, but also ambiguity. The Nazca Lines resist complete explanation, and uncertainty creates imaginative space. Every generation projects new ideas onto them. Astronomical calendars, alien runways, sacred pathways, water rituals, cosmic symbols. The lines become mirrors reflecting contemporary hopes and anxieties. And perhaps that endless reinterpretation is fitting, because ancient sacred landscapes were never static anyway. Meanings shifted over time even for the people who created them. Religion evolves. Symbols accumulate layers. Stories change. Maybe the Nazca Lines were always meant to provoke contemplation rather than provide neat answers. Or maybe ancient priests would find modern debates absolutely hilarious. Imagine explaining internet conspiracy forums to a Nazca ceremonial leader. Yes, thousands of years from now people will assume you built this spider for extraterrestrials. And somewhere in the afterlife, an exhausted priest quietly responding, "No, we just needed rain." End of part 4. At some point in almost every ancient civilization, someone eventually stares at the night sky long enough to become emotional about it. This appears to be universal. The stars arrive, silent, predictable, beautiful in an almost unreasonable way, and humans immediately begin assigning stories to them. Entire mythologies emerge. Constellations become hunters, monsters, queens, birds, twins, bulls, and occasionally deeply confusing combinations of all 5. Astronomy and storytelling blend together so naturally that ancient people rarely separated them at all. And in the Nazca Desert, under some of the clearest skies on Earth, this relationship between heaven and humanity must have felt especially powerful. So tonight, let us slow down even further. The air cools after sunset. Wind drifts softly across the desert floor. The heat of the day finally loosens its grip on the stones. And above everything, the sky opens. No electric glow, no city haze, just stars. Thousands of them. The Milky Way stretching overhead like spilled silver dust across black velvet. Honestly, even modern people become slightly philosophical under skies like this.
You start thinking about time.
Mortality. Whether your ancestors would be disappointed by your screen time. Ancient people experienced this every night. And because the Nazca civilization depended heavily on seasonal timing, celestial observation mattered practically as well as spiritually. Farmers need calendars. Religious ceremonies need ritual timing. Communities need systems for organizing seasonal labor. Before modern clocks and printed calendars, the heavens served as the most reliable schedule available. The sun rises predictably. The moon cycles predictably. Certain stars appear seasonally. Patterns emerge. And humans notice patterns obsessively. Sometimes helpfully. Sometimes while inventing horoscopes. Now, when scholars first proposed astronomical explanations for the Nazca Lines, they were building on a long tradition of archaeoastronomy, the study of how ancient societies observed and incorporated celestial events into architecture and ritual. And there are genuinely impressive examples elsewhere. At Stonehenge construction, alignments connect with solstices. Maya observatories tracked planetary cycles with remarkable precision. Ancient Egyptian temples aligned with solar events and star risings. Even agricultural festivals across cultures often synchronized with celestial markers. So when researchers looked at Nazca, they naturally asked, could these enormous lines reflect similar concerns? Maria Reich certainly believed so. She spent years studying possible alignments between lines and astronomical phenomena. One line appeared connected to the winter solstice sunset. Certain figures seemed potentially associated with constellations. And because the Nazca figures themselves include animals, comparisons with celestial symbolism became tempting. The monkey, the spider, the hummingbird. Perhaps these represented star patterns projected onto Earth, a giant sacred mirror between sky and desert. It is a beautiful theory, which unfortunately means reality immediately became more complicated. Because when later researchers performed broader analyses, many alignments failed statistical scrutiny. And here we encounter one of history's least exciting but most important truths. Humans are very good at noticing meaningful coincidences. If you examine enough lines pointing enough directions, some will inevitably align with celestial events by chance. Especially in a landscape containing hundreds upon hundreds of geoglyphs and pathways. This does not mean astronomy was irrelevant, only that the entire desert probably was not functioning as one gigantic observatory, which disappointed some people tremendously. Modern audiences love unified theories. We crave elegant explanations where every piece fits perfectly together like a documentary narrator assembling destiny itself. Ancient reality tends to resist this. The Nazca Lines likely served multiple functions across centuries. Some alignments may indeed have been intentional. Others probably emerged accidentally. And honestly, ancient people themselves may not have cared about strict categories anyway. Religion, astronomy, agriculture, and ritual all flowed together naturally. A solstice ceremony could simultaneously honor divine forces, mark seasonal transitions, reinforce social unity, and guide agricultural planning. Ancient spirituality multitasked constantly. Now, another fascinating element involves perception itself. Modern humans often approach the sky scientifically. We think in terms of planets, galaxies, astrophysics. Ancient people experienced the heavens differently. The sky was alive, not metaphorically, actually alive. Stars were beings. The moon possessed personality. Celestial movements reflected divine intention. Constellations carried stories embedded into collective memory. And in many cultures, the boundary between earthly and cosmic realms remained porous. Dreams mattered. Omens mattered. Animal symbolism mattered. Which means when Nazca people created giant animal figures in the desert, those images may have operated simultaneously on earthly and celestial levels. Not because they formed literal star maps, but because symbolism itself connected heaven and earth. A hummingbird was never just a bird. A spider was never just a spider. Everything carried layered meaning. Ancient religion excelled at layers. Modern bureaucracy also excels at layers, but in a much sadder way. Now, one particularly interesting aspect of Nazca culture involves ritual intoxication. Because naturally, once humans invent religion, they eventually discover ceremonial substances. This also appears universal. Archaeological evidence suggests Nazca rituals may have involved psychoactive plants like the San Pedro cactus, which contains mescaline. And honestly, staring at desert stars after consuming hallucinogenic cactus tea probably produced extremely memorable spiritual experiences. The ancient world was many things. Quietly psychedelic was occasionally one of them. Ritual-altered consciousness played important roles in numerous societies. Shamans, priests, and ceremonial leaders entered trance states seeking visions, guidance, or divine communication. Under such conditions, the landscape itself may have felt spiritually animated. Lines across the desert. Stars overhead. Ceremonial music echoing through darkness. Participants walking sacred pathways while interpreting cosmic signs. The entire environment becomes immersive. And perhaps that helps explain why the Nazca Lines feel emotionally powerful even today. They were never merely pictures. They shaped experience. Now, meanwhile, modern researchers continued refining interpretations using newer technologies. Satellite imaging revealed additional geoglyphs previously unnoticed. Drones mapped fragile figures more accurately. Statistical modeling tested astronomical hypotheses rigorously. And gradually, scholarship shifted toward more nuanced conclusions. Rather than asking whether the lines were astronomical or ceremonial, researchers increasingly recognize both dimensions may coexist. Some lines probably aligned intentionally with celestial events. Others guided ritual movement. Others marked water sources or territorial boundaries. Different communities likely used the landscape differently across time. Complexity returns once again. which is generally how history behaves when examined carefully. Now, interestingly, several scholars emphasize something called Sikh systems in Andean cosmology. The Inca later developed elaborate sacred line networks radiating outward from important centers. These Sikhs connected shrines, ritual locations, and cosmological organization into structured ceremonial geography. Some researchers wonder whether Nazca traditions anticipated similar concepts earlier. Not identical systems necessarily, but related ways of organizing sacred space through lines and ritual movement. And honestly, humans seem deeply drawn toward mapping meaning onto landscapes. Pilgrimage routes cross continents. Sacred roads connect temples. Labyrinths symbolize spiritual journeys. Even modern cities organize themselves around monuments and symbolic centers. We are constantly arranging physical space to express invisible beliefs. The Nazca people simply did it on a scale large enough to confuse future generations immensely. Now, let us drift briefly toward one of the quieter emotional realities behind all this. Nazca civilization eventually declined, like most civilizations eventually do. Environmental pressures intensified. Drought likely played significant roles. Social systems weakened gradually. There was no dramatic cinematic ending. No final speech delivered beneath lightning. History usually ends more softly than that. Communities adapt. Traditions shift. People migrate. Sacred landscapes remain behind. And centuries later, modern humans arrive trying to reconstruct meaning from fragments, which is strangely touching when you think about it. We spend enormous effort attempting to understand people who never imagined us. Ancient Nazca priests performing ceremonies beneath the stars could not possibly conceive of airplanes flying overhead filled with tourists holding smartphones. Nor could they imagine scholars debating statistical alignment probabilities across academic journals, or television hosts dramatically whispering about extraterrestrials beside giant spiders. History becomes absurd across long enough timelines. And yet, despite everything, the lines endure. That persistence feels important somehow. Human lives are brief. Civilizations rise and fade. But occasionally people create something that outlasts them completely. Not through conquest, not through violence, but through symbols. Simple marks in the earth surviving beneath desert skies. And perhaps that is why the Nazca Lines continue haunting imagination so effectively. They are both enormous and fragile. Visible yet mysterious. Human yet strangely beyond ordinary scale. They remind us that ancient people experienced wonder too. They looked upward searching for order. They worried about survival. They gathered in communities beneath the stars and tried to understand existence using the tools available to them, which is still what humans are doing now, honestly. Only with more podcasts and significantly worse sleep schedules. Now, before we drift onward, let us gently revisit the original question floating across tonight's story. Were the Nazca Lines an astronomical code? Probably not in the simplistic sense people often imagine. Not one giant, celestial blueprint waiting to be decoded like an ancient puzzle box. But astronomy almost certainly mattered. The heavens shaped ritual timing, agricultural awareness, and symbolic meaning. The sky and desert spoke to each other through ceremony, belief, and collective memory. And perhaps that softer answer feels more satisfying anyway, because real human cultures are richer than single explanations. Messier, more layered, more alive, much like the stars themselves. Silent patterns above the desert, watched by generations of people who came and went beneath them, each believing, hoping, praying, and wondering in their own ways. And somewhere out there tonight, the giant hummingbird still rests quietly in the earth beneath the same constellations, patiently ignoring every documentary ever made about it. End of part 5.